Animals understand much more when they're pressured to by humans under experimental conditions or cross-fostering conditions or breeding conditions than they can themselves produce. It seems reliable that animals are able to interpret human commands and understand much of human speech without being able to respond to us. You can think of the case of chimpanzees who were raised by humans as cross-fostered infants who could only produce mama, papa, cup, and up, but they could understand much of what their parents said to them. You can think of dogs who can understand much of what you command them to do, but can't say a single word in response. This suggests that the social requirements in human societies may have been the factor that spurred the evolution of nativist cognitive structures. Or we could interpret the evidence in an anti-nativist fashion, that language is a tool that we keep creating because the need for it is ever present. Of course, it's also possible that both of these explanations are working side by side to co-influence the progress of language. Either way, the social pressures of human societies are key in the development of language. Section 2.2 of the chapter, on page 19, begins to describe why this social pressure is such an important factor. First, we have to understand communicative intent, or communicative intent. You read here in this section a little imaginary story about two cave people who sit side by side. The caveman says to his wife, "Leopard," in response to some growl he hears out in the wilderness, and the author says the most important aspect of this little exchange that they just had was not the fact that the first word might have been spoken, but rather that both of those individuals knew that the caveman was intending to communicate with his wife. Without knowing that the intention was to communicate, the wife might have just thought that those were random sounds ejaculated out of his mouth arbitrarily for no reason. Importantly, communicative intent has been bred into the human condition. We are such social creatures that we assume any time words are coming out of somebody else's mouth, even as infants, that those sounds are being made with the intent to communicate something. The text notes that chimpanzees do not have this same assumption built into their very character. Chimpanzees fail pointing tasks in experimental situations all the time. For instance, when asked to choose between one of two containers, if an experimenter points at one of the containers in order to indicate that that's the container you should go for, chimpanzees choose arbitrarily between two containers. Even if the experimenter has proved him or herself to be helpful on previous trials by showing the chimpanzee where the food is. Dogs, on the other hand, are fully capable of understanding pointing. In one study, dogs would follow the point of a human even if the human was walking toward one food dish. The dog would walk toward the other dish that was being pointed at, as if it understood that the pointing was there in order to communicate some piece of information. Now, we don't think that dogs are smarter than chimpanzees. In fact, chimpanzees can understand a great deal more about the physical environment than dogs can. As one example, chimpanzees will pull on a string if that string is connected to food in order to get that food, whereas dogs, given the same kind of setup, will not pull on the string because they don't understand cause and effect relationships like chimpanzees do. Rather, we think that dogs have co-evolved with humans for such a long period of time that they have become as social as humans are. One piece of evidence in support of this interpretation is that wolves taken out of the wild and raised by humans do not exhibit this same ability to understand pointing. However, when foxes were taken out of the wild and bred over multiple generations to become domesticated, these foxes did exhibit the ability to understand pointing as a communicative act. Importantly, even human infants show the ability to understand pointing from a very early age. Human infants will respond to pointing and also will point in order to help other individuals locate a lost item. As you read in one study, an individual was working with a stapler, stepped out of the room for a moment. Another person came into the room, moved the stapler onto a shelf, and then left the room. When the original person entered the room again, he couldn't find the stapler and made confused faces to the infant, and the infant responded by pointing to the location where the object was. In the chapter on page 22, the authors list a little scenario about going to the grocery store and how many social rules come into play in just that one little situation. The point that the authors are trying to make here is that animals haven't developed language because they aren't socially cooperative enough to need it. The demand isn't there, and therefore the tool hasn't been invented. However, on page 23, the argument is made that it might not be so much about the social need being there, but rather the social capabilities. That animals are not capable of engaging in joint attention. This vocabulary word here is defined for you as the awareness between two individuals that they know they're both paying attention to the same thing. So, in the wild, there's no clear evidence that chimps engage in some situation where chimp A knows that chimp B knows that chimp A is staring at the same thing as chimp B is staring at, that they're both on the same wavelength and that they're both paying attention to the same thing. That is necessary in order for humans to have engaged in that first dialogue that was proposed here, in which some caveman said, "le bird," in response to, some cry out in the wild. The evidence that suggests that joint attention is such an integral part of developing language is from studies of human infants. Here we see that the more joint attention babies engage in by looking where a parent is pointing or responding with gazing where a parent is gazing, then the more language, the more vocabulary the child develops after 30 months of age. This right here is showing what's called a gradient relationship, where incremental increases, small little steps of increase in one variable, result in equivalent steps of increase in the other variables. So the IV and the DV here, the IV here being joint attention and the DV being language development, have a gradient relationship. Of course, some research studies suggest that chimpanzees don't have the ability to engage in joint attention, but some research, as outlined in the method box 2.2 on page 24, suggests that in fact they do have the ability to put themselves in the shoes of another chimpanzee. So when chimpanzees are placed in an experimental situation where one of the experimenters has a bucket on his head and the other experimenter does not, and they both have food, the chimpanzee will beg food randomly between the two individuals with no more propensity to beg from the person who can see the chimpanzee than the one who has a bucket on his head. Obviously, this suggests that the chimpanzee is not putting himself in the shoes or in the perspective of the person who has a bucket on his head. If a person has a bucket on his head, then he can't see the chimpanzee and can't respond to begging. On the other hand, when you put a chimpanzee in a more realistic situation where a chimpanzee lower on the social hierarchy is expected to find food that's been hidden in the room, if the lower-ranking chimpanzee can see a food source that is hidden from the higher-ranking chimpanzee, then that's the food source that the low-ranking chimpanzee will first approach, suggesting that the chimpanzee can, in fact, put himself in the shoes of or in the perspective of another chimpanzee, though they will struggle to put themselves into the perspective of a human when placed in a very strange experimental situation. So, even though we have some evidence that suggests that chimpanzees don't have the capacity for joint attention, we do think that they, in some realistic situations, can know what another person knows, or in other words, they do have what's called a theory of mind. They can put themselves in the perspective of another chimpanzee.